Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. In our busy world of global missions, there are, of course, lots of things unfolding. Today, we have the opportunity to dig a little deeper into North American trends. Now, I want to mention here that the audio was a little chippy during this recording. We're sorry about that, but we felt that you'll still be able to follow the train of thought, and the content was certainly worth sharing. Our guest today on the Global Missions Podcast is Ted Esler, who now serves as the president of Missio Nexus, an association of mission agencies and churches representing over 30,000 Great Commission workers worldwide. That's amazing, Ted.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to be a part of Missio Nexus. There's a lot of great things happening.
Yeah, wow. Well, Ted has worked in the computer industry before he became a church planter in Bosnia. He's also an author and a podcaster, and he served in various leadership roles in the Mission Pioneers, including the role of Canadian director. We have something in common there, Ted. Ted and Annette now live in Orlando, Florida, and they have 5 grown children and 1 grandson. Ted, welcome to the program.
It is great to be here. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, as we record this, Ted is just recovering from the Mission Leaders Conference 2017, which was held last week in Dallas, Texas. Ted, are you getting back in gear after that great event?
Well, I think the word recovering is probably a great word to use because it's a big event. It takes a lot of energy from my staff to myself. It was a really fun event. So it's good to have it done, but it was also a great event to be at.
Well, we really appreciate the work that you and your team put in to have such a valuable conference. Next year is in Orlando. I'll just mention this already. The dates are out, September 20th to 22nd in beautiful Orlando, Florida. And the theme will be partnership. So you can watch for information on that conference for those that are serving on a missions committee, maybe a missions pastor and leading global missions from your church or agencies, of course. Great opportunity to network and learn together. Ted, just as we get rolling, please tell us just a little bit about your role with Missio Nexus.
About 2 years and maybe 2.5 years ago, I became the president of Nexus after having served in various roles in executive leadership with one agency in particular, Pioneers. So we have a small team. Our focus is to be more of a network or association. So we're not trying to grow a large staff. We have 5 people. Most of us work virtually. We do have an office in Atlanta. Our job basically is to work with the Great Commission community in North America to make them be more effective, particularly as it relates to sharing information, expertise, partnering together, collaborative kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. One of the expressions that often comes from this association is the Great Commission is too big to do alone and too important not to do together. And so we really appreciate that you're catalyzing great conversations and learning together, Ted. It's working.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that.
So our topic today specifically is what's happening in missions today. We're in 2017 as we record this, and Ted is really well positioned to help us with a high-level view of the missions movement involved with lots of churches, lots of mission agencies. Ted, some of the topics we're going to discuss are found in this new book, the Missions Handbook Research Project. Just for foundations here, tell us a little bit about the project. Why did you undertake it, and how was it completed?
Well, this handbook has actually been created we're in the 22nd edition, and those don't come out annually. They're usually about every 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. But the last one hadn't been done since 2008, and we recognized that it needed to happen again. And this is basically just an overview, really focused on mission agencies, particularly on how big, what the scope is, where the reach is, where people are working, et cetera, in the Great Commission globally.
Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of topics here. I've been in a workshop to cover some of the data with Michael during the conference, but I thought we could just tease out a few things here. When you look at the demographics, what did we learn about the people who are participating in missions?
Well, I mean, a few things stand out right away. For example, I found this to be a very interesting thing. There's 3 single women for every single man, almost 4. That kind of a fact, I think, can be really helpful to us as we think about how to care for particularly the single women that are among us. Overall, the number of missionaries globally has slightly grown. I wouldn't call it explosive growth, but it's grown somewhat. Now, the numbers in this book are really coming from mission agencies, and there's a lot of work that happens outside of mission agencies. But by using consistent numbers, we know that among agencies, we're continuing to see some growth in the mission agency movement.
And just to be clear here, the statistics we're talking about are North American statistics as opposed to global church, right? So we're talking about the United States and Canada in principle. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct.
We did have a discussion with Paul Borthwick at the end of last season on Western Christians and Global Mission, his book on that. What's the role of the North American church? Of course, our role is changing. And so if you're interested in that, the growth and the change in the majority world church and how that interacts with the North American church and agencies here, you could check out that episode. So slightly more workers, lots of single ladies compared to single men. Maybe the last thing, as far as general observations, let me ask you about the ministries that people are going out to as far as where they're going to. Are they going to the same places or are they going to different places? And the types of ministries they're engaged in.
Well, a couple things I would say. One thing is that in the past surveys, people have given numbers regionally, but in this survey, there was a marked increase in people that just wanted to say that people were global. And they're doing that because of security concerns for their missionaries. So we did see some shifts in the regional deployment numbers, but I have a sense that most of that shift simply has to do with how they're being reported, not significant shifts actually in where people are being sent. Maybe the one outlier there, believe it or not, is Oceania, which is more than doubled, almost tripled in terms of how many missionaries are deployed there.
Going down to the islands then.
That sounds good to me.
Oceania
so I would say that's one thing.
Yeah, for that region, just so people know that, like south of Southeast Asia, really, they're down Australia, New Zealand, and then north into the islands there.
Now, in terms of activity, that's changed too. And here what we're seeing is what we've typically called more traditional activities, evangelism and discipleship, has fallen off, while relief and development, education, training, mission agency support, all of those things have gained. They've done it pretty much at the expense of evangelism and discipleship. However, I think in that number, what we're seeing is a changing role for the North American. Because whereas, even 10 years ago, it was more common to find a North American go out and do evangelism. Now, that same North American is going to be involved in partnering with nationals who are doing the evangelism. And the role of the North American is going to be more, for example, in education and training. So I don't think it's fair to look at these numbers and say, oh, missionaries are doing discipleship. It's just that the role of the North American has shifted pretty substantially in the last decade.
Well, this is a really helpful transition because although I wanted to tease out some of these observations that you've shared, I have asked Ted to talk with us about 3 macro trends that he's observed in the results of this study. And one of those trends was a shift from classical missionary activity, if I could call it that, religious worker, going as a religious worker, having a visa that says, I'm a missionary and I'm here to do religious work, to other kinds of ministry, such as tent making and BAM. Is that a typical shift that you're seeing broadly? Is that happening a lot?
I think so. I mean, I think when you look at the numbers that we collected for tent making in BAM, now in the 2008 survey, some of these terms have become more specific in the last decade. So the 2008 survey, I don't think that you're going to see, it just basically has a category called tent making, but it would be any kind of non-traditional sending. And interestingly, those numbers did increase, even though my sense is that many of these people are doing tent making without agencies involved. In other words, they're just moving over, perhaps getting a job or starting a business, and there isn't necessarily agency there. But even so, the agency participation has increased. I find that really encouraging that the new models of mission are being deployed even by agencies.
Well, I wonder here, one of the things we want to do is try and provide advice and wisdom to missions committees. I wonder what advice you would have for them in approaching this transition trend. If they've historically sent out more religious workers, people that would have that in their passport, to this new dynamic, how can they participate fruitfully in this?
I have seen many mission teams. I've seen teams that are made up fully of what we call traditional missionaries, as well as people that are using all these new models. My sense is that the best teams are hybrid teams, where you have maybe one or two full-time workers whose focus is solely the ministry. But then you have a next ring, which may be, for example, tent makers who have limited time to participate in the ministry, but who can feed into that ministry in different ways than the traditional missionaries might be able to do. And teams that are comprised of many different types of missionaries, I find to be the higher performing teams. So if you're looking to send somebody out, for example, that wants to do tent making, there's no reason why they can't hook up with an on-the-field, long-term team. Maybe they're professional missionaries, that's all they do. But working alongside in partnerships, I think it'd be a lot more fruitful, both for those long-term missionaries and for the tent maker. So if I'm a church, and I'm sending missionaries out from my church, and I'm involved with that, to me, that would be a high priority, would be to ask about the types of partnerships that are available in that field. And anymore, unless you're really going to the remote areas of the unreached, most of these tent makers are going to major cities around the world, particularly if they're working jobs. So in those places, there's many opportunities for partnership. That's what I would be looking for.
So what I hear you're saying, really, this is not a competition. One should not replace the other, but they are complementing each other.
Totally. Even in my North American context, frankly, I'm doing church planting here. And what we're finding is those groups that are working with a few full-time workers as well as a larger number of tent makers, they're having more success.
That's great. I realized we maybe should have done this sooner. We're using a couple of terms that people might not be familiar with. What do you mean by tent making, and what do you mean by BAM, please?
So tent making is typically when you go and you find a job working in a corporation or a company, and that provides you with your visa and your income, etc. Typically, tent makers don't raise support, although some may raise a little bit of support. When we talk about BAM, it's most often, not exclusively, but it's most often focused on people that are entrepreneurial and they're trying to start businesses where they're going. And I would say in the last couple of years, the term that's become even more popular in the missions community is business for transformation. And that's a broad term that represents a number of these different models that might be present.
Well, here's a trend that is emerging in these days, a positive trend. I think you'd agree, Ted. You're saying a hybrid team is valuable, so this is a positive trend?
I think it's fantastic. I'm aware of agencies that have specific programs designed to make avenues for people that are coming through non-traditional means. And if you're looking to go overseas and work in a tent making capacity, I would highly suggest you consider talking to a number of agencies first to see what kind of partnership possibilities are going to be there on the ground when you arrive.
Great. And as our regular listeners know, we do keep show notes from this program. And so we'll actually ask Ted to contribute some of those that he would recommend. If you're interested in exploring this, we'll provide you with some links and you can begin to do some preliminary research that way. We're going to take a quick break now to share about an organization that may be of help to you in your church as you engage in the Great Commission. We'll be right back after this message.
Reach Europe, change the world. Greater Europe Mission focuses its ministry to the needy continent of Europe and countries closely associated geographically. Jim, a family of over 300 missionaries, is committed to reaching Europe by multiplying disciples and growing Christ Church. To learn more about Jim and the opportunity to serve in Europe, visit www.jimmission.org. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Ted Esler, the president of Missio Nexus, unpacking some of the trends affecting missions today. Ted, we just talked a little bit about the rise of non-traditional missions, and I'd like to go to a trend that it's causing a bit of consternation at times, actually. And according to the study, it comes out this way. The church nowadays is struggling to find common definitions of really important terms, such as mission, missions, and missionary. What's meant by this? Why has this happened? What's going on here?
First of all, I just point out that those words, mission, missions, and missionary, they're not biblical terms. And so we're not able to lay a really precise theological definition on them as much as a historical definition on them. And I think we need to also recognize that the world is changing, and that's a part of the change that we're seeing around us. In the United States and in Canada, a lot of the mission that used to be strictly overseas has come to us. Mm-hmm. That's created a different view of what mission is. And then also, particularly in Europe, you have the idea of re-evangelizing seculars. And a gentleman named Leslie Newbigin has been writing about that for some decades. And in the academic world, there's been a shift in terms of how we understand and see what mission is. But I think for the average layman, it really comes down to what is the mandate of the Great Commission? What are we trying to accomplish? And because we have particularly professionals in the mission arena, they've gotten very specific with what that definition might mean. On the other hand, on the far end of the spectrum, you have some churches. For example, you might have seen this sign as you drive away from a church, especially if you're down in the deep south of the United States, that says you are now entering the mission field. Mm-hmm. Well, in the mission world, particularly with the professional missionaries, they wouldn't say that the U.S. is the South, particularly in missionary field, because it doesn't conform to this idea of unreached, where there are no Christians, there are no people there that would be able to communicate the gospel to them. Obviously, that can happen in the southern part of the United States. Mm-hmm. Anyway, all of that has led to a questioning about what is the task that we're trying to accomplish. Another piece of this I think it's important to point out is that postmodernism is deconstructive. Postmodernism is always asking, how can we define this thing away? In the case of mission, I believe that, philosophically, again, academics particularly have tried to whittle away at the definition of mission. And then, of course, there's the issue that we mentioned already. The shifting role of the North American means that what you went out to do 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, now is something that you're going to do in partnership with someone that's an indigenous person. That has also contributed, I think, to a shifting definition of mission. Mm-hmm. My sense is that in 2010, for example, the community of missionaries and mission agencies were feeling a little bit of an identity crisis. And were asking themselves, what is it that we're supposed to be doing and what is our primary calling? But I feel like now in 2017, that's kind of dissipated and people have come to the conclusion that, there's a lot for us to do. We just need to do it differently. And we need to be willing to embrace this new role. And so I would say among many practitioners, the answer at this point is kind of like, who cares? We just know that there's a lot of loving to do on people that don't know Christ. And we need to get out there and make that happen.
So some of your advice might be to focus on the job that needs to be done instead of the definition?
I think so. And I also think, particularly if you're looking at it from a local church perspective, I think technology and changes in the world have made it possible for your local church to be directly engaged in global mission. And I would not shy away from that. And I would just suggest that people really think through how God has enabled them to participate in the Global Great Commission and really take that battle up as much as they can.
Ted, of course, we want to wrestle with this in a healthy way. If you had the opportunity to speak to the missions committee again, what advice would you have for them in this dilemma of definitions?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is just that there's a lot of work that is to be done out there. And we could sit around and talk and discuss these definition issues. But the bottom line is there's people out there that we need to love on and let them know about Christ. And so I wouldn't get too hung up in these definitions. However, there has been a discussion about who owns mission. As mission agencies have gotten very involved in the Great Commission, at times the local churches felt left out of that equation. And so some have said, well, listen, in the scriptures, there were no mission agencies. It was the local church that God sent out on mission. I would just be cautious about that in a couple of ways. First of all, for sure, mission agencies as we know them today didn't necessarily exist in the scriptures. However, when the scriptures talk about the church being on mission, it's rarely the local church. It's talking more about the church universal, all of us who are believers. And I'm not really sure how much this debate about who owns mission has actually contributed to our understanding of what the task is and what needs to be done. So I would just tend to deflate that a little bit. On the other hand, changes in the global economic systems, changes in communication, travel, all these things has made it possible for every person in your local church to participate in the Great Commission.
Right.
And so I would encourage churches to really think about how they are going to have a specific involvement in the Great Commission and not just to leave it up to mission agencies. There's plenty of work out there for all of us, and it needs to be an all-hands-on-deck proposition.
Well, some great advice there of balance and focus, intentional participation. I'll just mention that our next episode is an interview with two authors, Denny Spitters and Matthew Ellison. I know that Ted knows both of those authors. Their recent book is called When Everything is Missions. And so we're going to dive a little deeper into some of these topics. You might be interested in that. This is episode 64 with Ted, and we're going to go on to episode 65 with Denny and Matthew. Ted, we've got time for one more trend, and I wanted to ask you about this idea that there are new networks emerging to accomplish global missions. What have you observed about networks these days?
Well, today there are hundreds of mission-focused networks, and there's new ones every day. Oftentimes they are focused on an area or region. Sometimes they're focused on a strategy or a paradigm in mission. Let me give you two examples if I could. This last year, I was able to travel to the Nuba Mountains, which is in the nation of Sudan, and it's right alongside South Sudan. And the people that live in the Nuba Mountain region are literally trapped between two civil wars, one in the north in Sudan and one in the south in South Sudan. And they're very unreached and they need a lot of help. And my host on that trip was the Greater Nuba Action Coalition. And they are made up of people from different mission agencies, different churches. In fact, the leader happens to be a layman who's an executive with AT&T and does this kind of on the side. And that's an example of more of a geographically or people group focused network. On the other hand, there are strategies or paradigm networks as well. The International Orality Network is calling attention to the fact that the majority of the world's people are not actually reading and writing as their primary way of learning, but are listening and watching. And the Orality Network seeds itself into all sorts of agencies, all sorts of churches and movements around the world. And therefore, they are able to influence through their network in that way. And if you're in a local church context and you're looking for ways to meaningfully engage, I would be looking to these different networks because in many cases, they can plug you into good resources and kind of fast track what you're trying to do.
Yeah. On that note, I would just like to mention another episode that we did not long ago with Eldon Porter. It was called The Strategic Value of Global Networks. And he's put together a website that helps us find relevant networks. It's called Linking Global Voices. You can find that in the show notes again here on this episode. And what he's done there is he's brought together a database of people who are linked geographically or linked by some ministry theme and helped us find people that are doing what we would like to do. A great resource, and hopefully that would be of value if you're looking for a network. Boy, we've just scratched on the top of some of these trends, of course, Ted. This data in the handbook is very rich, and I appreciate some of your synthesis. Who would this book be good for? Who should look to acquire the Global Missions Handbook?
The Global Missions Handbook is really great if you're looking for information on specific agencies, particularly contact information. In terms of the data charts and the research papers and whatnot, there's, I think, about 5 different chapters that are topical, and they're large, kind of big picture trend kind of ideas. So those would be the 2 primary audience to look to with this book.
Well, if our guests wanted to learn more from Ted Esler and from Missio Nexus, how can they get in touch with you, Ted, or follow you? How should we reach out to you?
Well, on Twitter, I am Tedster, TEDSTUR, and missionexus.org is our website. And there's a contact form on the website. If they fill that out and mention that you want to contact me, it'll get to me real quickly. So that's probably the 2 best ways.
Well, if you had any last word to share, Ted, we'll tuck it in just a minute. I want to say thank you for spending this time with us. You're standing before the missions committee, people who want to faithfully serving global missions help their church do it better? From your point of view, what do you want to say to them?
I guess the primary message I would make is just to keep in mind that even though the Great Commission is being done differently today than it was 15, 20, 30 years ago, there is so much work to be done out there. And now is not the time to think that somebody else is going to do the task, but we as North Americans need to be involved directly. And I would encourage them to think about their involvement through missionaries, through nationals, through people that are sitting in their congregations every week. And so I would just say it's a all hands on deck proposition. They should jump in because the water is fine.
Great encouragement from Ted Esler, the president of Missio Nexus. Ted, thanks so much for taking this time with us today. Lord bless you in your work.
All right. Thank you very much.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation today with Ted about what's happening today in missions, at least on the North American scene. Remember, you can find the show notes on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com, and that you can use the filter there to find episodes about any particular topic you'd like to learn about. If you enjoyed the podcast, we'd sure appreciate a review on iTunes, as this helps potential listeners give us a try. And remember, you can always use the website to let us know about suggested topics or interviews that you'd like us to consider. That's all for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.